Wow, that is so much later than I thought.
The findings were opposite for boys versus girls.
Just the knowledge that it's happening at all is something that's relatively new.
They sort of had more, higher ambitions than their sample allowed, I think.
The idea that autism doesn't connect with sensory processing feels wild.
What is the context that is important here?
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited for this episode today. We are going to be talking about sensory processing and ADHD, which is something that we haven't really talked about enough. And we're going to find out why. There's not a lot of studies on it, but the ones that do exist have a lot of interesting things to say about what we're doing. So the first paper we're going to chat about today is a brain paper, which we love, looking at how gray matter correlates of ADHD in boys and girls with sensory processing dysfunction. So Sarah, do you want to take us through a little bit about what they wanted to do?
Sure. So first I'll talk a little bit about the sample. It was on children aged 8 to 12 years old. And I think that's really important. They sort of later flagged that as a limitation, sort of for adults and things like that. They separated these children into, I believe, 3 groups. So 45 of them had ADHD without sensory processing issues. 34 had both ADHD and sensory processing issues. Oh, and it looks like they didn't have a control group. So I'm flagging that as another limitation right off the bat.
Yeah. Actually, that brings up a good question. Before we go any deeper, I want to just say for all of you listening, probably thinking right now, that's great, Sarah. What is a sensory processing disorder?
Yeah, that is so good. I really struggled to give context to how much knowledge do you have, right? So for everyone, actually, let me go to the second paper to get that.
I think they struggled as well. I saw a lot of almost very varied definitions.
Yeah, the reason why they might struggle is because there's lots of different terms to refer to it in the research. And in fact, it is now its own separate diagnosis in the DSM, but it hasn't always been, right? So this article, this gray matter article we're talking about now, calls it sensory processing dysfunction. A meta-analysis that we're going to look at later calls it sensory processing difficulties.
But essentially, it is that idea of not being able to modulate, discriminate, or create an organized response to sensory information. So that could be auditory information, different kinds, however you take in information, basically using your 5 senses.
Yeah, I think the reason why it's difficult is because defining this is interesting. Sensory processing is really just experiencing stimuli in a way that is atypical. And so that could mean a hyper response, overreactive response to stimuli. We would see that as overstimulation. But then it could also be a hypo response to the stimulation, which means underactive. That's we'll talk about that later as sort of a low registration, having really high pain tolerance, that sort of thing. That's how that would manifest in real life.
Exactly, yeah. So if you're wondering kind of what we're talking about, that's what we're talking about. When you feel overwhelmed by things that are happening, and I know for a lot of people, because we have a lot of clients that we work with, there's many ways to feel this, and that's what we're getting at. Okay, so this study, to kind of come back to it, what they wanted to know was there a difference in the gray matter's density and volume between boys and girls, as you said, with ADHD alone compared to those who had both ADHD and the sensory processing dysfunction? So Sarah, do you want to take us through a little bit more?
Yeah, so they're looking for functional brain differences in the structure of the brain. What do these brains look like? Can they find any patterns between them? Things like that. Because, essentially what they're trying to isolate here is early warning signs, risk factors for sensory processing issues, so that we could really implement treatments and education earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what they were looking for. How did they do it? Take me through that a little bit.
Well, they were also this is really important. It sort of is alluded to in the name of the paper, but they were also looking for gender specific findings here. They wanted to see if it looked different in boys versus in girls as well, which I think is really, really kind. However, the sample was skewed heavily male. So 72% male. And when all is said and done, that means that there were only 22 females in this study.
Yeah, which is quite a small sample to be making.
Another limitation.
Yeah.
So how did they do it? So sensory processing was a diagnosis based on caregiver questionnaires. ADHD was diagnosed by clinicians, which is great.
Yeah, we love that. I noticed they used a slightly different tool to do the diagnosis than what I've seen before.
Yeah, they talk a little bit about this one. It's called the behavior assessment for children. I suspect it's because it's for children that we don't usually hear about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't really get into what makes it different. I could probably ask, but do we want to get into it?
No, I think it's all good. I don't think we need to because we're not really talking about kids. I just wanted to flag that they didn't use the DSM because I think it's always interesting when they use a clinical non-use thing we're used to for those people who are going through some diagnosis maybe with their own kids.
That's true. That's a really great point. Keeping it relevant for everyone. And then, okay, so let's get to the brain stuff because this is really interesting.
They used a coil.
I don't know what that is, but it says, the direct quote, they underwent high-resolution T1 weighted MRI scanning to analyze these different measures of the brain that they were looking for.
The only thing I could see was it said it's to enhance the signal of the fatty tissue and suppress the signal of the water, whereas a T2 weighted MRI enhances the signal of the water. And that makes sense because they were looking at particularly at the
fatty portions of the brain.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, it was interesting. So I don't know because they don't go into it in too much detail, but I can imagine that people would have had to go into one of those big spinning MRI machines to do this particular test.
Absolutely. Any MRI is going to require for you to get in that tube, particularly this one being on your brain, like you have to go in head first. So
yeah. And they specifically talked about they were pretty happy with it. They said it was state-of-the-art brain tissue segmentation.
Well, good. I trust them.
Yeah.
Good for them.
Yeah, so they were pretty happy with it. And it's always good to be looking at these kind of like very structural elements.
Yeah.
So what did they find? And I'm going to flag that by saying they found a lot. So we're going to focus on what is particularly relevant.
Exactly. Yeah. We're going to filter this through what matters, right? Like what is the context that is important here? And the bottom line, they did find functional differences in ADHD and sensory processing kids across basically all regions of the brain.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing here is that the findings were opposite for boys versus girls. Again, in the ADHD and sensory processing category, they had opposite relationships. So what that means is different functional sort of brain structure differences between gender differences.
Yeah, different parts of the brain were lighting up. Different parts of the brain were sort of signaling.
Fantastic.
And I think it's interesting to discuss it, and they hinted at it here, and I really think it's worth mentioning. Not only did they have less girls than boys, but they also mentioned that girls were more likely to come with a diagnosis of ADD, not ADHD. And so they were sort of hinting at the reason that might be the case, especially I think when you're looking at boys and girls.
Oh, inattention versus hyperactive subtype.
Yeah.
They don't do anything about subtype in this study, so that would definitely be a future direction.
Yeah, and they mentioned it themselves that what they might be seeing isn't so much a gender difference, but a hyperactive versus inattentive subtype of ADHD. So that might be what's lighting up the brain. So I just want to mention that.
Hi, Sky here, just popping in with a quick strategy for you. As some of you might know, we've recently launched the Goals Achieved with ADHD Academy, and some of our members kindly agreed to have their sessions recorded so that I could share them with you. So what you're about to hear is a snippet of a strategy that Amani and I worked on to help her with her goal of getting a job. So hopefully you'll find this strategy helpful, and if you'd like to talk with me about how you can achieve your goals with ADHD, just click the description below to book a free 15-minute focus session and we'll get started together.
How do we beat that procrastination, rejection sensitivity cycle around this incredibly complicated, incredibly rejection sensitive thing?
Applying for a job brings up so much in me. I'm giving myself these deadlines, which are my kryptonite. If I were anybody else, I would be like, it is not a big deal. What matters is that you get them out.
There's different parts of applications in general. Some of them are rejection sensitive, some of them aren't. We need to divide tasks into things that are stressful and things that are not stressful. Do the more relaxed bits, and then we're going to get a bunch of dopamine and chunk together all of the stressful bits and do those together. We want to separate the writing the application self and the sending the application self. How do you feel about the strategy? Are you happy with that as a thing to try?
Yes. Very, very excited about it. That sounds great.
So is there anything else we wanted to say that they found?
No, that's really it. Again, we sort of mentioned the limitations along the way.
Small sample size, not that many girls.
They sort of had more higher ambitions than their sample allowed, I think. Maybe they ran out of time or funding or whatever.
I think that's often the case. And I do feel for all of those people. It's really rough to do these things, especially if you're doing brain scans. But they did find those structural differences, and that was very interesting.
Yeah. And I have an ADHD kid, and we didn't talk about sensory issues at all. It wasn't part of the assessment process, not from the pediatrician anyway. And so we've never had any sort of information given to us about sensory processing. Everything I know about it is sort of from personal and from work means. So I think what this would look like, what it would look like to better support kids with ADHD and sensory processing issues is sort of education about that. Like that is a thing that exists.
Yeah.
Maybe.
100%. And actually, we're going to try and start knowledge that it exists. That's what we're going for here.
Step one.
And to that point, at the end of this podcast, we are going to talk a little bit about some practical skills to do with sensory processing.
Sure. I'm jumping the gun.
Yeah. No, it's great. I'm just putting it in there, in case you're wondering, because it is so important and it is something that we are learning about. It kind of reminds me, to be honest, looking at this paper, it reminds me of the beginning of the discussion of rejection sensitivity and emotions and ADHD, where we sort of were like, light bulb, this might be connected. And then it kind of started to gain traction. I wonder if we'll start to see sensory processing doing the same thing.
Yes, I don't want to spoil it too much, but the next sort of paper that we're going to talk about suggests yes.
Brilliant. That's so cool. Well, segue. The next paper is the Journal of Psychiatric Research. This paper is from 2022, but was pulled specifically to go with this other study, looking at sensory processing difficulties in psychiatric disorders, and it was a meta-analysis. What they wanted to do was basically look at sensory processing difficulties amongst adolescents and adults across a broad spectrum of psychiatric conditions, including ADHD. And we're talking about it as a sort of introduction to sensory processing disorder paper. So Sarah, do you want to take us through what they did? It was a very cool paper.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in addition to how helpful this paper is to explain sensory processing issues, it was really neat to read in the introduction sort of how the diagnosis, how the conceptualization of the sensory processing disorder, formal DSM diagnosis came to be. You don't always get to read about that. It's history stuff in these research papers. So that was neat. We'll get into that.
Yeah.
So how did they do it? They did a systematic review. They did a great review. They came away with 33 articles in the end. They were specifically looking for stuff that talked about self and proxy reports, like self-report questionnaires. Proxy report questionnaire, by the way, is sort of if you fill out the survey for your kid on your child's behalf as a proxy for. So that was interesting. They followed rigorous quality standards for the papers that were included. They were all peer-reviewed. They made sure not to include any duplicate data and things like that.
Yeah.
But really, they were focused on comparing the 4 quadrants of what they called a sensory profile amongst the different diagnostic groups. So how do the different groups sort of display different sensory profiles is the word. Yeah, that's the phrasing I'm going with.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of this whole sensory profile thing?
Not really. It is new for me. To be honest, I'm one of those people who only really, and we'll get into it, but only really talked about or heard about sensory difficulties when it came to autism. Until I started working in an unconventional organization and doing the research and things like that, that was very much where it came from. And I think it's reflected in some of the papers.
Absolutely. So this paper talks about how there's some estimates that say 90% of autistic people also have some kind of sensory dysfunction. I think that sounds right. Just because of what we know about like what is affected by autism, I think. Also, while the paper, this meta-analysis that we're talking about, it does reference 3 different papers on ADHD and sensory processing. It doesn't mention ADHD once in the actual body.
Which is strange. I had to go through the actual paper and
I loved
thank
it.
Goodness they put it in. I could highlight it, that these were the papers that they were referencing. And they even did a very lovely little chart that showcased the fact that 2 of them were overstimulated and one of them was understimulated. But the actual, like you said, the word was not included. It was mostly a discussion about autism and when they were actually talking about the paper.
Yeah. Well, that's okay. Because that's why I basically chose to include this paper, right? I wanted to talk about the different aspects of what they're calling the adolescent adult sensory profile. We've got sort of 4 different behaviors, I'll call them. We've got sensory seeking, which is sort of an under and over response to stimuli, sort of like craving that stimuli or not, sensory sensitivity. So that's usually like an increase in internal or external stimuli.
So they said overreacting could be an example of this.
Yeah, somebody might say like, oh, you're overreacting, like, oh, you're being dramatic, or
I can think of an example of that, which is if you pull something out of a pill bottle, sometimes there's like a cotton ball in it, and like I can't touch those. To put it bluntly, it makes me feel, and that I think would be a very, very big response to stimuli.
Yes, I think that is the sensory sensitivity for sure. Getting the ick to particular sensations. That makes so much sense.
Yeah. Do you have one? I'm curious.
So, those like microfiber cloths that you can they're like reusable, like cleaning cloths. Well, I love them for cleaning, but unfortunately when they're dry and my hands are dry and they like catch me with their tiny little threads that are always like fuzzy. I don't know, for some reason it's just like, it's yucky. Like, I don't, not a fan.
Yeah, for those of you at home, play along. What is yours? Let's all have this feeling together.
At me. At me on Instagram. I want to know what your sensory icks are. But I want to highlight that this is different from sensory avoiding. This is like wanting to limit or avoid exposure. So like you never even get to the stimuli. And so now you're having like avoidant behaviors.
Yeah. I thought that was so interesting that they said one example of that could be wanting to be alone. So it's possible that like
that withdrawal.
Yeah, that withdrawal and that idea of there is a feeling of like, you know, if someone says, hey, do you want to go to this really great party? It's going to be super loud and overwhelming and underground and full of smoke and a whole bunch of other things. You might be like, I just want to be alone. And that could be sensory avoiding.
Right. Exactly. And then the last one is really interesting. I alluded to it earlier because it's definitely not one that we talk about in the ADHD space, but it's called low registration. And it means that for whatever reason, you just don't process all of the incoming stimuli. So you're going to manifest as like having a very high pain tolerance, where most people would be in pain. You're like, I don't know. People who have that temperature regulation issue where they don't know when it's cold or hot outside. Alexithymia is a great example of this low registration thing.
Yeah, I thought this was so interesting. We were talking about it before we came on today's episode. I was thinking about it in terms of, I think I've accidentally used this on purpose when I was trying to, because I don't like needles. And one of the things I found really helps with that is if I'm listening to a podcast, for example, when I'm like at the doctor's office, which is always a fun thing to have a conversation about, I can kind of like increase my, like I'm sort of like not registering the sensation as much because I'm distracted by the other sensory processing that is happening essentially. And that, and just, you know, you're like, how did I get this bruise? Where did this come from? Because you're busy and you're walking around and you don't notice it.
Wow. I'm just sitting here with my mouth like wide open for those of you who are just listening at home, because that one. I was like, at first I was going to say like, I don't know if this really resonates with me at all. And then Sky said that about having bruises and cuts and not knowing where they came from. You're just like bleeding down your hand. Okay.
Like,
let's talk.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's talk. Let's talk about the results. What did they find?
So sensory seeking behavior was lower in all groups that they saw. So they were looking at sort of various different psychiatric conditions, you know, autism, bipolar, depression, probably ADHD. And they were comparing their subject scores to the sensory profile to the control scores for that sensory profile. And so, sensory seeking was lower in all groups with the diagnosis, most notably in autism with intellectual disability. Yeah. Sort of trauma and stress-related disorders. It looks like other, like the neurodevelopmental ones that they were looking at.
They also found differences in sensory sensitivity and avoidance, which is interesting. And again, they didn't mention ADHD, but they did give us the data so we could see what ADHD papers was doing.
Yeah. So what they saw here was there were actually higher scores. So indicating like increased sensitivity, increased avoidance. So all of the diagnostic groups sort of had this increased sensitivity, increased avoidance, except for autism with intellectual disability, which I think makes sense. And then the thing that I want to say about low registration, it was higher in most groups.
Yeah.
Which indicates really like just the common tendency to overlook or not react to that sensory information.
Yeah. Which I think is such an important thing to consider. It's like, how much sensory stimuli are you not noticing is coming in on a daily basis, because it might be higher than you think.
All those Instagram accounts talking about like how many decisions I make in a day as a mom. And I'm just like, Or
just like, what does your space feel like? What does your space smell like? Or, I don't know. It's just an interesting, I think this comes back to the grounding conversation. Like, and I have been, since we've started doing this podcast, trying to be doing some grounding every day. And it has been interesting just kind of continually trying to ground myself and be present. It's not super comfortable, honestly, sometimes. And I feel like part of it's as well, it's like that idea of just low registration. And suddenly it feels like lights on, and now it's high registration. Now everything sensory is coming in.
Oh, sort of that that emotional lability, in terms of your like activation of your nervous system.
Yeah.
Sort of like the back and forth, sort of like the mood, which is why we tend to get misdiagnosed as like mood disorders, sort of like they're like, oh, mood swings kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to, before we move on, because like, yeah, grounding is part of this conversation, right? I feel like the way I'm able to show up for myself in terms of how I'm able to do grounding is definitely different every day. But why are we talking about this? This meta-analysis pretty much shows that, sensory processing variations are significant across many different psychiatric diagnoses. And so that means that there's probably a need to better understand what's going on here. Is sensory processing disorder its own separate disorder, as the DSM is now suggesting? Is it sort of happening alongside autism? Is it happening alongside ADHD?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are great questions. And I think that's, again, it reminds me of the question about emotional regulation or emotional dysregulation. Is it ADHD? Is it happening alongside ADHD? But just the knowledge that it's happening at all is something that's relatively new.
Yeah. Actually, I'm just going back to the paper to look for that history conversation here. So it looks like the first reference to sensory processing was in 1963.
It's not massively, it's like not that long ago.
It's not super old. No, not super old. Yeah. And then we had sort of more work in the field of sensory processing theory in the 90s. That's the 1990s.
Which is around the same time as there was a discussion of ADHD. Yeah.
Yeah. It became part of the diagnostic criteria for autism in the 2013 update.
Wow, that is so much later than I thought. The idea that autism doesn't connect with sensory processing feels wild to me. It's such a thing that we talk about all the time.
Yeah, it really just finishes up this conversation by saying exactly what I already said. Some people wonder this is part of an independent, the sensory processing issue is independent of the other psychiatric condition. And we're not looking at it, right? I specifically went looking for papers on ADHD adults and sensory processing issues, and I found nothing. Zilch. Nada. Nothing.
Yeah. You found these papers. This was it.
Yeah.
Like if you
they had it on for ADHD children, which I think is great. It's really helpful. Children become adults, but also there's all these late diagnosed, probably ADHD adults that have sensory processing issues that don't know that they have sensory processing issues, and they've never heard of this before.
Exactly. Shout out to all the people who need to wear headphones a lot. Shout out to all the people who need to wear sunglasses indoors. Like, these people exist.
Can't stand it when companies change the scent of their favorite dish detergent or clothing soap.
Yeah. Or the lights in the office, the sounds in the office,
fluorescent
the smells
lights
in the office. Yep.
Yep. When we're talking about this sensory processing stuff, again, we're talking about all 7 really of the senses. The basic 5 that we always talk about, but then also that proprioception, that movement and balance.
Yeah, that's true.
Where is my body?
Yeah.
Because that is also stimuli that can be really like just a lot. There's just a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think we joke about it all the time. If you've seen those memes of somebody walking along with ADHD and they're kind of like moving in a strange way, because that's how we tend to view ourselves. I think it's a good conversation to have. I hope that there's more of these.
Yeah, for sure. I would love somebody to do something on ADHD adults specifically, because as the first paper, the gray matter paper, was talking about, the brain like changes over time. So
Mhm.
whatever it functionally looks like when you're a child, it's going to look different when you're a grown up. So
Yeah.
that's important information that we just don't have right now.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Well, is there anything else you want to add about this paper or the other paper before we talk about some practical strategies?
No, I think we have educated these people to death.
Sorry.
I could put up a poll on the podcast. See if you've learned enough yet.
We love talking about this stuff. Like I said, we did this just because we love doing it. And so, yeah.
I just wanted to talk about this.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say that you've been listening to this, right? And you're like, okay, Sarah, okay, Sky, I am sold. I have sensory processing struggles that I didn't realize. But what does that mean? Like, what do I do about that in my day-to-day life? And I think that it is important, first of all, just to know that it's happening. Again, we talk about grounding, we talk about mindfulness. Those things, those activities can be helpful to sort of re-center you in where is my body? What am I doing? What am I feeling? Both internally, but also externally. We've talked a lot about internal feelings, but also external feelings. Is it too bright? Is it too loud? Like those kinds of things might be happening as well. I will say, and I just want to flag this, if you're somebody who doesn't do a lot of mindfulness and you happen to struggle with sensory processing, you might find coming into your physical body a little bit confronting. And because of that, one of the things I sometimes recommend to people who are doing these kinds of practices as an ADHD kind of tip is to make a sensorially inviting environment first and then become present in that environment. So like, is the space like that I can look at and I think this would feel good, this would smell good, this would look good, and then go into it. So like sitting in a blanket, if it's spring for you, in a park with a nice day with some music on, and then doing the grounding routine. Sometimes that can be helpful as a starter.
Yeah, definitely. I love talking to clients about understanding their sensory needs and sort of designing different environments to meet those needs. So whenever I'm talking about this, I always like to have a couple of different conversations. One, are we overstimulated by our internal selves, by our intrusive thoughts? Like, are we the problem? Or are we, again, overstimulated by that external environment? Because the strategy that you use is going to be different for each. Again, as Sky said, sort of that early awareness of the need for the strategy is crucial to being able to try, experiment with strategies, and eventually strike on something that works for you, right? Yeah. Personally, when I'm like really overwhelmed and I just need, like, I'm super overstimulated and I just need to calm down, I guess, I like to go in the dark. I don't know, I take in a lot of light through my eyes, so I could just like see in the dark. So I just go in the dark, preferably like a closet. Like if I can like hide in the clothes, it just feels so cozy, like a hug, and sort of reducing and controlling my sensory input in that way can allow me to also implement that grounding strategy like Sky suggested. And I know that in advance.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I don't know if we've talked much about what kind of type of ADHD you have. I have combined type, but it's quite high on the hyperactive type. And so what I find is that I need to go on a walk, preferably like a vigorous one. Just like, I'm out and usually like wearing headphones or something like that, or talking to somebody if I'm with somebody, and just kind of like looping and like walking and then becoming aware, being able to like ground myself and be aware of my environment in that active movement space. Because if you put me in a closet, I would become very stressed. And I think it's just interesting. It's like, I'd be like, oh my gosh, you put me in a closet and you grounded me. This is too much.
Yeah. No, I'm actually thinking like now, like that's like a whole vibe, right? Like, is it maybe when I'm feeling sad, I go into the closet, and like when I'm feeling angry, that's when I go do like some rage cleaning, or like I just
Yeah.
angrily start like purging clothes from my closet that I haven't worn
Yeah.
in 3 years.
Yeah.
You know what? There's definitely a strategy for every vibe, for every mood, for every emotion. You know that feelings wheel
Yes.
to like
Yeah.
help you understand your feelings. I wonder if we could create a feelings wheel that has like a coping strategy chore associated
Yeah. I love that. I love that.
associated with each. Let's do that. Yeah, we'll do that.
Yeah.
And if you want to help us and you're listening, at me on Instagram at the ADHD Skills Lab podcast.
Sensory feelings wheel. Okay. We're building. People are like, how do you make these things? It's like we talk, we do research,
Yeah.
we talk to clients.
Brainstorm.
And that's how it works. And it's funny you should say that, because I'm in the process of right now building a program, the Goals Achieved with ADHD program. And it's basically combining a lot of what we do to help professionals with ADHD. And one of the pieces of that is creating a sensory stack that you can sprinkle throughout your week. And what that looks like is actually sitting there and going, this is, touch, taste, sound, all of those things, and coming up with like 5 different sensory activities, which is harder than you think. I haven't completely done it yet. And then stacking them into chunks of like, these are the different, this is what I like to smell and then look at and touch and at the same time. And then also sprinkling it throughout your week so that you can kind of elevate the stimulation in your week. And I guess a reverse would be also like having, combining that with like a feelings wheel. So you have different go-tos for different things, because it is like a whole other language that we're unused to speaking, because we don't even know that it's a thing we need to do.
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, will the lessons ever stop coming?
I mean, not yet.
No.
You're like, are you going to run out of ideas? I'm like, not when I don't run out of problems.
Yeah, I wish I had my magic 8 ball, which apparently is a super American thing, because I would just be like, is the end in sight? Shake it up. I would probably be like, chances unlikely.
Don't ask me. Yeah. Well, it's funny because I think that's a good point, though, is the feeling of being a bit exhausted and a bit overwhelmed by this stuff, ironically, given we're talking about sensory stimulation. And it is tricky because, we were born in a majority neurotypical space. And as a result, the entire space is not created to support us. And that's definitely a conversation for therapy. I think it's a really important conversation to have. But it is, the way most of our experiences of life are. And what that means is it can feel very overwhelming and a lot of work to build these systems, but it does get easier. Sorry, I sound like a PSA now, but it does get easier because...
Well, you figure out what works for you. You figure out what you like. You realize that you have a thing you need to compensate for, or support, accommodate yourself in some way.
Exactly. You build these systems, you build these strategies, and then everything starts to feel easier, and you start to reach your goals, and you start to, do things that you want to do. And then you start to move, you build that momentum, and it starts to feel good. And then at that point, you're just kind of like bringing new and interesting things in rather than having to change everything all the time. So I just want to say that for those people who are feeling kind of overwhelmed by another thing that they have to think about.
It's very much just about trying to identify what about your environment you are in control of.
Exactly.
And then figuring out how to take that element and make it work for you. We spoke to Stephanie recently, and she was talking about aromatherapy and specific scents targeted for specific activities. And you can very much harness that sort of sensory experience to create the same working conditions, the same workspace. reliably time after time. I love candles.
I'm not allowed candles. I think we've had this conversation.
Yeah, my husband like hates the smoke aspect. And so for that reason, for the most part, I respect his sensory needs. Every once in a while, I like need to have candles because it's just really nice.
I love that.
But yeah, as long as I minimize it, right, I'm still being considerate.
Yeah, I don't have candles, but I've got two right here. I have this it's like a stick of perfume. It's like a solid perfume. You can get them from Lush, and they smell so good.
Yeah. We can often like get down on ourselves and be like, oh, well, I shouldn't need this. But if you can accommodate yourself just by like wearing a specific type of pants or like buying all the same type of shirt, why wouldn't you? Like, why do things need to be more difficult?
100%. Yeah. So go out and seek positive stimulation this week, whether it is low sensory seeking or maybe high sensory seeking to, help with dopamine, whatever you need. It's a real thing. They've done studies on it in the brain. Which is always the thing. You're like, ha, it's real. Even now, even after so many years of studying this. Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Sarah?
I'm just gonna be running from all the big lamps for the rest of the day. That's sort of my favorite evening routine tip for all ADHD folk. Sort of reduce your big light needs as early as you possibly can.
I've seen that on social media. People have been talking about, if you live in a neurodiverse household, it's like no one should touch the big light because turning on the big light is a whole thing, and like everyone has lamps.
I don't understand why my husband uses the big lamp. We have a perfectly good small one.
I'm so curious.
Is that strange?
Do you guys use a big lamp? Yeah. Awesome. Okay, well, this was a really exciting one, and I'm really, really keen to see what we talk about next time. Okay, see you later.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to reach out or connect with us, you can leave us a message at admin@unconventionalorganization.com.
You can also find out more about our ADHD coaching organization, read our free articles, or sign up to our online courses at unconventionalorganization.com. That's organization with a Z or an S. They both will get you there.
If you'd like to learn more about what we discussed here today, or you want to read the transcript, you can find that at our show notes page at unconventionalorganization.com.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and think someone else might find the strategies and stories helpful, the best thing you can do is share episodes using the share button in the podcast player, or leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify or your podcast player of choice, letting them know why you've benefited from this podcast.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you back in the ADHD lab next week.